So let me just begin by explaining something about this presentation. This is based on a presentation I did for an entirely different purpose. My colleague and friend Barry Lower is retiring, and there was a conference in honor of him, and Barry and I have been arguing for decades about laws of nature, whether they exist, what they are, and so on. And so I did do a talk which went into some technical detail that's been eliminated. But the basic question was about how we come to decisions about what exists. What are the basic methodological tools? And I thought that's a good general question and would be relevant for a dialogue. Now, the words just used were between faith and reason, which is not the way I'm thinking about this, between science and religion. If the religious people want to say we're not on the side of reason, okay, now we're in a different territory altogether. And so I thought I could take some of the technical things out and put some comments in, which I hope will make it seem a bit more relevant to the occasion. I almost got rid of Barry, but he's still in there on one slide. And there are some things that might seem a little clunky to you because I'm all of a sudden talking about laws of nature. So I'm just explaining. All right. So if the issue is science and religion, let me give you my quick overview that I came up with, right? That I understand the aim of the center is to discuss the relationship between science and religion. I'm not a philosopher of religion. I have no expertise in that subject. But I did try to find something that might be of interest to the center. Now, here's a view that was produced by Stephen Jay Gould, the evolutionary biologist, which goes under the name NOMA, which stands for non-overlapping magisterium. Right? So this was his attempt to reconcile in some way or make peace. And it went more or less like this, that science and religion cannot possibly come into conflict because they address completely different topics. Science is about and investigating facts. Religion is about and discusses values and norms. And then we pull up our favorite quote from Hume, you can't derive an ought from an is. So whatever factual claims science manages to come up with or accept or think reasonable cannot in principle settle or have bearing on the question of what is of value or morally correct. So, well, yeah, so the conclusion is science and religion cannot in principle come into conflict. So, as I say, Galileo would beg to differ on that conclusion. It's a plain historical fact that religious doctrines and institutions have come into direct conflict with scientists and scientific theories. And those conflicts, where they come up, are clearly factual, right? They're about conflicting factual claims. How old is the universe? Right? If you go to the Bible and count, as I recall, you get back to what, 6006 or 4004 BC on a Tuesday at noon. I mean, whoever came up with the number, that's when God said, let there be light. All right, well, cosmologists really will not accept that. Does the Earth spin on its axis and orbit the sun? That was the issue that got Galileo into trouble. That is not about values. I mean, we all know Galileo said, the Bible tells you how to go to heaven, not how the heavens go, right? This was also the idea that somehow, they're just on different topics. But for sure, the Catholic Church at the time had opinions about whether the Earth spun on its axis and orbited the Earth, and Galileo had different opinions, and that led to a lot of trouble for Galileo. are human beings descendants of a common ancestor with the apes, or are human beings descendants of a common ancestor with the earthworms? Obviously, evolutionary biology thinks, and I would say has established the fact in that case, and many religious people find that intolerable and are upset about it. Okay, so I think, you know, it would just be pretending that there isn't a problem here to think that Gould has solved this with non-overlapping magisteria. These magisteria do overlap, and where they overlap, they often disagree. Now, certainly on the factual side. On the value side, of course, you know, I read a textbook on quantum field theory. There's nothing about what I should do or how I should behave or what's good or bad. So yeah, I think science tends to make few, if any, claims on the normative side. Of course, scientific claims are relevant for what we call instrumental rationality, not what's good in itself, but what's the best way to achieve what's good, right? You should take science into account. If you say, for example, you care about suffering and that suffering is a characteristic only of conscious beings, then it comes into question, well, what are the conscious beings in the world? Right? Are bees conscious? Are dogs conscious? There are literally physicists out there, or quasi-physicists, pushing the view that electrons are conscious or quasi-conscious. Okay, now that could have, I guess, amazing ethical implications if it were true. I think it's nonsense, but if it were true, I guess it could have amazing ethical implications. But that's the exception. Now, the main topic to which my comments here may be relevant is the particular religious claim, on at least the naive reading, that religions do claim the existence of certain beings, either a god with a capital G or a bunch of gods with a little g. And these are just factual claims, right? These are things that exist. And again, another anecdote I'm sure you all have heard maybe, that Napoleon had an interview with the famous physicist Pierre Laplace, who was doing celestial mechanics. Newton, of course, had claimed that he saw in celestial mechanics reasons to believe that God existed, that God needed to intervene in the solar system from time to time to keep it from basically falling apart. And I guess Napoleon asked Laplace, in your research, have you found these indications of God, or what does God have to do with it? And supposedly Laplace replied that he had no need of that hypothesis, right? And it may have been a very direct rebuke of Newton, saying, I can explain why the solar system doesn't fall apart without these interventions, right? And, well, what do we get from that? Well, I think cosmologists would all agree that they don't need recourse to a hypothesis of a divine being in order to account for the orbits of the planets. They have a little more trouble with galactic rotation curves, but they need dark matter for that, not God. But so what? I mean, does the fact that you don't need the hypothesis to do science indicate that there is no such thing? That would obviously be a way too quick of a conclusion. But you can say, I think, what I say here, that if this hypothesis that there's a deity plays no role in accounting for empirical theory, and the empirical theory gets all of the observations right, then no empirical evidence can be brought forward in support of theism in that way. Okay, so here's my take on this, and then we'll get into the main meat of this. I think that in the usual way, I keep adding in the usual way, because I understand there are people who want to use the word God exists, but when you probe them deeply exactly what they mean by it, it's not the usual way. mean, Einstein famously said, because he was famously not a religious person, that he believed in the God of Spinoza, which was nature. All right, so that's kind of a fancy footwork to say, look, I'm just examining nature. By my rights, I'm doing theology, right? But of course, by most people's rights, you're not. Panentheists believe something similar. So I understand there are lots of moves that can be made here. I'm just going to, there's this blank question, is there a deity? We could get into the definition of that and so on, but it just looks like a factual claim. And as a factual claim, scientific inquiry and results should bear on. But that broad claim doesn't give us all that much guidance. Now we have to get into the question, well, how scientifically, how is it that empirically or generally science deals with claims about existence? Right? How do scientists, just in their own domain, get to a point where they think, I have good reason to believe this thing exists, especially where the thing at issue is what we would call fundamental. And I'll get into that in a minute. But do I really have reason to believe that neutrinos exist, or fields, or quantum fields, or dark matter, or dark energy, or a bunch of things that you'll find in the physics literature? Wave functions, quantum states. That's the topic I want to address here. Okay. So now kind of start again after that preamble. There's a topic that goes under the dual names metaphysics and ontology. Those really mean the same thing. It's just the account of what exists. And if we go into what kind of existence one might attribute or deny, there are different sorts. So let's just begin there. Basic ontological question, as Quine said, is what is there? And then there are specific, that's the general question, then you can ask specific questions, right, about some X. Does X exist? Are there X's? Is X real? These seem like good questions. And it seems to me that there are three possible answers, and we ought to focus in on them. First answer is, and the correct answer is, there is no such thing. Right? X just doesn't exist. The Loch Ness Monster does not exist, period. End of story. There is no such thing. Stop asking questions about it, like where it came from, or whether it's a dinosaur, or all these questions that might occur to you. There is no such thing. Therefore, those questions have no sensible answers. That's just the distinction between what we call fact and fiction. So that's a good answer. I mean, logically it's a good answer. It's a clear answer. On some topics, right, it's highly debated whether the items exist at all. And this I didn't add here. This one was already on the original presentation because it's one that comes to mind. God. Some people are on the side of ain't no such thing, and some people are on the side of there is such a thing, and then they have different views about what it is. Numbers, right? Do numbers exist? Do mathematical items exist? Objective moral values, do those exist? And as just a little side note that maybe everybody here knows, these two questions, does God exist and do objective moral values exist, are different questions. In Euthyphro, Plato famously gave an argument, which I think to this day is correct, that there isn't really a connection between those. Many people think there is. Right? Many people think if there is no God, there's no objective moral values. And the Euthyphro argument was no. Even the gods, if they exist, do not have the power to make things good or bad. They may have the power to recognize or understand what is good or bad, but they don't have the power to just decide what's good and bad. I think he was right on. So I would certainly want to separate this question from this question, and actually I would myself give different answers to this. Now, once this got started, again, we're back with Parmenides. Immediately, Parmenides raised a question about, can you even meaningfully say about something that it doesn't exist? Right? Is the claim X does not exist even logically coherent? Parmenides had an argument, which is kind of a clever argument to the result. No, you can't meaningfully claim of anything that it doesn't exist, for more or less the simple reason that if it doesn't exist, then the word you're using doesn't refer to anything, and if the word you're using doesn't refer to anything, then what you said doesn't have any meaning, so it's just gibberish. Right? How can it be true that Santa Claus does not exist if there is no Santa Claus of which it's true? Yeah. Quick argument, and off the top of your head, kind of has a convincing ring to it, but it led Parmenides into such bizarre conclusions that most, normal people would say you must have made a mistake somewhere. Quine famously gave us an account of what the mistake was. Anyway. So that's one answer. No, it doesn't exist. Now there's another kind of answer, another kind of thing that happens when this question of existence comes up, which is to say, okay, there's no real serious dispute about whether these things exist, but still there are informative things to be said about what we might call their ontological status. For example, pianos, right? Well, what do I mean by that? Let me go back a second. I take it there's no serious dispute that there are pianos. It's not like the Lochman's monster, right? Pianos exist. Causation? I'm not sure if that goes in this category or not. I put it in a question mark. This talk isn't about causation, so I won't come back to it. In any case, pianos do exist. They're real. They're not fictional. But still, you would say, yeah, but they're derivative. They're not fundamental. That's their status. Their ontological status is, yes, they exist, but they're not fundamental. In a certain sense of fundamental, they're derivative. In what sense? Well, pianos are made of more fundamental things that have been put together in some way, right? And you go down through levels of construction, right? A piano, all right, it's made of strings and keys and hammers, but the strings are made of metal coils, and the metal coils are made of atoms, and the atoms are made of quarks. And the quarks are made of not anything as far as we know, now that we've gotten down to the bottom and we're at the fundamental, right? Now, you want to make this distinction between the fundamental and the derivative for reasons of vagueness. Because when you have derivative items, then you need defining conditions for them in terms of the more fundamental ones, in some sense. And those conditions can often be vague. So this is the source of the standard Sorites kind of argument, where we can imagine a Sorites series that starts with a Bosendorfer grand piano on this side, and then somewhere hundreds of kilometers away, a harpsichord with tiny little changes between each instrument and the next. And you say, well, that sure is a piano, and that sure isn't a piano, but there's no fixed spot at which piano-ness goes away, right? There's no sharp dividing line between the pianos and the non-pianos. That upsets some people. It doesn't give, I don't lose any sleep over that myself. Yeah, the concept of a piano is vague. They're kind of contextual conditions under which it's absolutely clear. Somebody says, go into that next room and count the pianos, and you say, okay, there are 10, right? Period, end of story. Because it doesn't have any of these half piano, half harpsichord objects. Anyway, vagueness, creates some problems, But again, I don't lose a lot of sleep over them if there are problems about derivative items. People might say, oh, well, we shouldn't just use set theory and say there's the set of pianos and its complement is the set of non-pianos. We should ascribe degrees of piano-ness. But of course, that's going to be vague too. I mean, it doesn't help in a deep sense. But in any case, I would say that all this stuff about vagueness, that's a question for what we call semantics, theory of meaning, it's not really a question in ontology. I mentioned causation before. I think causation is a kind of derivative concept. There are clear cases, as clear cases of causation as there are clear cases of pianos, as clear cases of no causation as there are clear cases of non-pianos. And if you're clever and if you're an analytic philosopher, you're more or less trained to think of the funny little cases that sit in the middle where you kind of pulled in one direction and pulled in another direction. If causation is not a fundamental notion, I don't worry about it. I worry about what the fundamental notions are. So we have answer 3. You say there are some things, they're real, but furthermore, they're not derivative, they're fundamental. They're not composed or made out of anything else. There's not an ontological analysis of them in terms of their existence being dependent on anything else. But, in fact, it's these things from which all the derivative items are derived. So if you want to believe in pianos, which you should, and you want to believe that pianos are not fundamental, which you should also believe, then you ought to think there are some fundamental things from which pianos are made, and you might wonder what they are and how they have to be put together to make a piano. It's important to notice the methodological difference between how we deal with the fundamental and the derivative, right? Because for the derivative items, it's always appropriate to ask for an ontological analysis. That's the point of it being derivative. It's not, it depends on something else. And you might ask, well, how does it depend, right? How does the existence of pianos depend on the existence of quarks at the end of the day, and electrons? That's really a lot of what is involved in what we call understanding, comprehension, is to see how the derivative is made out of the fundamental, or anyway, the more fundamental. But obviously, that's the kind of the key question for the derivative. What is it? The what is it question, Plato's question, TSD, what is it? What is that thing? For a derivative item, the correct answer, or the most informative answer, is to give an analysis, an ontological analysis of it. But obviously, by definition, the fundamental admits of no such analysis. Otherwise, it wouldn't be fundamental. So whatever grasp we have or understanding we have of the fundamental must, of necessity, be of a different character. And it's worthwhile to think about that. Right? It's unavoidable. How do you grasp the fundamental? If you can't grasp it by analysis, I think there are things to say here. Now, this is, again, this was more written to be worried about laws of nature and quarks and things like that than deities. But let's at least think about that. What kind of information can I give you about the fundamental which would be enlightening? Well, in the case of physics, I can give you a state space. So if I get down to something like, what I had in mind here were quantum wave functions or quantum states, it doesn't matter. You give me, if they can have be in different states, if the fundamental can be in different states, it's useful to understand what the scope of that is. What is the state space? What are the states available? Right? And I can tell you that. What forms can there be of an electromagnetic field? What kind of geometries can space-time have? Right? What is the set of quantum states available? These are all good questions that are not purporting to be analyses of what an electromagnetic field is, but is telling me something useful about it. Sometimes you can give me a dynamic. So once I have this state space, like an electromagnetic field can be in all these different states, then you can write down an equation that tells me how those states change through time, or might change through time. Right? That's a dynamics. That's, again, useful information. It's not an analysis. Again, I didn't write these thinking about deity. You can kind of see the problem for deities here. I mean, not so much if you're a Greek. Right? If you're a polytheist, then there's a state space for deities, right? There can be a war god, and there can be, a messenger god, and they can, have different psychological states, and you can even understand the dynamics, what they get mad about, or what they're trying to achieve, and you tell a whole story, right? If you're a monotheist, it's a bit more difficult. Can God be in different states? Can God change? I mean, is God Parmenidean, right? If God is Parmenidean and not subject to change, how could God be relevant to the everyday world, which does? How could God even know about the everyday world, which does change? I mean, I understand the Maudlinists or somebody said God can't. Right? The only thing God can know is the facts that don't change, like the laws of nature. God has no idea that I'm giving a talk here, right? Okay, that's a view. It's an interesting view. It obviously would change a lot about standard religion if it followed from the nature of God that God can have no idea whether you're committing sins or whatever. That the information's not available. And then we have what we might call the ontological architecture. If you have different fundamental items, and in any case, you've also got the derivative items that are built out of the fundamental, you can explain how they're related to each other, how the different fundamental things relate to each other, how the different derivative things are built up out of the fundamental things. And this gives you comprehension of the derivative things, but at the same time comprehension of the fundamental things to understand the role they play in this general argument. So I think, these are the sources we have, at least some sources, for understanding the nature of proposed fundamental objects, since we can't possibly understand their nature by analysis, by definition. They don't have an analysis. Okay, and I think that, to come back to vagueness, I think vagueness is a semantic matter. Language can be vague. The world can't be vague. There are philosophers who are fond of talking about vague objects that have nothing to do with vague language, and I never have understood it, and I still don't understand it. I think the world itself, the vagueness isn't even the kind of thing that can apply to the world. It can apply to a representation. And so the state space, if you've got a state space for your fundamental things, that should not be vague. The dynamics should not be vague. These should all be things that are sharp. There may be vagueness, again, comes into the question, how is the derivative composed out of the fundamental, right? How do electrons and quarks have to be put together to make pianos? But that's just where we want the vagueness to be. It's in the concept of a piano, as it were. It's not in the actual collection of matter sitting in front of you. That has some sharp, precise state. Okay. So when you do fundamental physics, and you put fundamental in the name of it, then, of course, the question of the derivative, it takes a bit of a backseat. It can't take a complete backseat, but it takes a bit of a backseat. You're concerned with the state space and the dynamics, and everything should be pretty sharp, maybe expressible in terms of mathematics. But this question of how the derivative arises has to come up. Why? For confirmation theoretic reasons. Because we cannot directly access the fundamental empirically, right? What I can see empirically, like this pen, I can see it because it's big, and it's big because it's derivative. So however it is that you make contact between your empirical observations and your fundamental postulates is going to be mediated through something derivative. And there the vagueness could come in. Physics per se doesn't care about how pianos as such are composed, right? You don't have to answer that question using physics. Now we're down now that we focus down on the fundamental postulates, ontological postulates, and again, a moment for, at the moment for physics, you notice that they, which are in some sense the most important postulates, are not directly observable. Space and time by themselves, even not just at microscopic scale, at macroscopic scale, are not observable directly. Right? You can't see space, you can't touch it, you can't taste it. It doesn't have, doesn't have a color. And of course, electrons you can't directly see, quantum states you can't directly see, and so on. None of these things are what we would call directly observable. Now you're better off if you're a biologist, you're better off if you're a geologist, right? Then you've got some subject matter. You can, what are the rats doing, right? How fast are they making it through the maze? That's something you can basically directly see, so you can get pretty straightforward empirical data. But for a case like physics, you can't get that kind of direct empirical data. To that extent, again, to run this parallel, if among your postulates is going to be a deity, nowadays anyway, mostly I take it you don't think you believe it on the basis of direct empirical access. I mean, some people do, right? Somebody came, God came to Moses, burning bush spoke to them. That's all empirical, right? But nowadays, I take it, thoughtful people about this don't make that claim. So, but of course you don't make it in physics either, that you directly saw that there was an electron, right? You inferred somehow from what you directly saw that probably there's an electron. So it's when we get to the epistemology or the confirmation theory that this now becomes very important. How is it that if I propose in a physical theory that something exists, I'm going to defend that somehow by appeal to observation or empirical data, but then what's the connection between what I observe and what exists that you say this observation gives me good reason to believe? Again, not proof. We're not in the realm of thinking that the observations logically prove that these things exist. We all understand that. This is all fallible. But still, we think the observations have some bearing on making it more or less plausible that something exists. And we can call what Wilfrid Sellars called the manifest image of the world, the things we think we have direct empirical access to, and just remark that that is really typically and maybe always derivative ontology. So now again, if your science is about derivative ontology, right? If your science is about biological systems, so what? Then you have no, you can be in more or less direct contact with your subject matter. But if it isn't, then you've got this mediation problem. So, as I say, physics doesn't have to be concerned about pianos as such, but it does need an account of needles, dots on screens, right? The sorts of things, tracks in cloud chambers. It needs to understand how those form if it's going to appeal to them as evidence for or against a theory about the fundamental. And so there might be some vagueness, and you hope not. You hope, I did an experiment, the needle went to the right. You say, yeah, the needle is a vague term. How thin or how fat does something have to be a needle? And you say, okay, but it was a needle. Don't worry, right? It came out of the factory. It's fine. It's an okay case of a needle. We're not going to worry about that. Dot, right? What makes a dot on a screen? There's some vague, but you think that vagueness is not going to be really a problem in a serious way. Now, this is what now we're really away from theology, but I hope you can see that I'm going to raise a question about laws of nature, right? And methodologically, as I understand it, these are running parallel to hypotheses about deities. Don't directly see them. What reason do you have to believe for them? And so on. Now, it turns out for laws of nature, there's a big dispute in the philosophical literature. Do they really exist fundamentally or not? Are there laws of nature? And if you think of this Einstein line about he believes in the God of Spinoza, which is nature, right? Deus sive natura, whatever it is. And if you think, as many physicists would say, it's not just any old detail about nature. I want the fundamental, and the fundamental is going to be expressed as a law. Many high-energy physicists, the holy grail is a law you could write on a t-shirt. It in some sense captures all of, and when you say captures all of physics, what do you mean? Well, it's the fundamental dynamical equation, somehow the fundamental equation that governs all of nature. Now, if you think of that as a law, then if somebody comes along and says, you know, there are no laws either, then this would have, this of course would be a shocking view, or it would require you to rethink what you're trying to do or what science is about. If you thought it was about discovering the laws of nature, but it turns out fundamentally there are no laws of nature. And in a way, the Humean is arguing there fundamentally are no laws of nature. So now the roles, by the way, the roles, as I say, you can run this about laws and you can run it about deities, and now my personal role reverses here. I'm the guy who's saying there are laws of nature. I'm, as it were, the theist, and the Humean is the atheist. Whereas in the other case, I'm the atheist. Okay, they're the theists out there. All right. So these people who want to deny the fundamental existence of laws of nature, a group of them go by the name Humeans, and the view they have is called Humean supervenience. And now I'm deep into kind of analytic metaphysics of science, but I'll just do this for a few minutes and then I'll be done. So just bear with me. Because I think it's worthwhile thinking how this debate goes through, exactly because it's running parallel to other debates you're going to have. When you ask, what is this doctrine of Humeanism or Humean supervenience, there are different forms of that doctrine. They're floating around under that name, and then you need to separate them or else you're going to get very confused. I'm going to give you two. There were originally three, but the third one gets so complicated it's not useful here. I'm just doing this kind of analogy. There's the Humeanism that literally comes from Hume, right? There's Hume himself held various views, which are properly called Humeanism. And the point about Hume was that he was a strict empiricist. There was a strict empiricist doctrine about concepts or ideas. So he asked, well, where do our ideas come from? Right? I mean, a lot of this is going to have to do with concepts, and then you ask again, well, how did we get them? What is their content? And Hume held a strict empiricist view about concepts or ideas, which becomes a view about semantics or meaning, because for these people, quite reasonably, they didn't think language was all that important. Language was obviously a convention, right? Russians developed entirely different linguistic conventions than the French, than the English. So what? The point of the language, of the linguistic items, was to be associated with concepts. And that's, a Russian speaker, the way they were thinking about it, could have one and the same concept as an English speaker and have gotten it exactly the same way, right? They opened their eyes, they had an experience of blue, they made a copy of it, now they've got the concept of blue, and this is, just Hume. And one calls it blue and the other calls, I don't know, the Russian. I shouldn't have started with the Russian. Whatever the Russian for blue is. All right, so the linguistic differences aren't very, of course, we now think that that's way too naive a picture and that concepts are much more complicated, and that in fact the language you learn makes available certain conceptual systems that might not be available. But this was Hume, right? And so, you know, he held that this was true of all simple ideas. The only way you could get a simple idea, and this depended on a distinction between simple and complex ideas you already find in Descartes, and probably before that, I don't know the history that well, certainly it's already in Descartes. Okay, I have complex ideas, they're derivative, right? Now we're back to the derivative and the fundamental. Complex ideas are derivative because they're complex. What are they made out of? They're made out of simple ideas. Where do I get the simple ideas? Well, I don't build them up because they're simple. They're copies of our impressions, right? Our simple ideas, the only simple ideas we have are copies of our impression. Now Hume, at this point, if you know your Hume, he's a very careful, meticulous guy. He says, well, there's this funny case of the missing shade of blue, which is a simple idea maybe I never had, but I can nonetheless somehow conjure up this shade of blue I never saw if I have this whole string of blues and I notice one could go in here. But he says that and then he dismisses it. Yeah, it's such a weird case, don't worry about that. Our simple ideas are copies of our impressions. Our complex ideas are built out of our simple ideas. And you can see how that's, you know, very much parallel to this idea of a fundamental ontology, derivative ontology, construction, simple and complex, and so on. And what Hume then said was, if you think you got an idea, which you can be under the impression you have an idea because you have a word. Now we're back to ideas and language, right? You might be under the impression you have an idea because you have a word that you use all the time, but maybe that word is just kind of not actually attached to any idea or concept at all. And he was worried about causation. Because he says, I can't experience it. Right? That can't be the source of my idea of causation. Because I think that when I pushed that pen, the finger caused it to move, but I didn't see any causing going on. Right? The actual content of my observation was just succession in time. Right? The pushing preceded the moving. But as we know, post hoc ergo propter hoc is a fallacy. But it wasn't even the inferential fallacy he's worried about. He's saying, but where do I even get the idea of causation? I don't see it. Right? I see regularities in space and time. I don't see causation. So it's not even a question of how do I know what causes what, but what do I mean by saying that something causes something else? This was Hume's problem. And that's his issue. As you know, Hume solves it by offering not one but two different definitions of causation. They both, he thinks, have a kind of peculiarity that whether a particular event, like my running my finger at this pen and then it moving, that a particular sequence, to say that the first one caused the second, the defining conditions have to make reference to things that he say are foreign to the cause, by which he means you have to make reference to something that goes beyond the finger pushing the pen and the pen moving. And he gives you two different ones, right? One is that beyond that particular sequence, you need a regularity. That is, in order for the one to cause the other, it has to be a general regularity throughout all of space and time, that kind of pushing is followed by that kind of moving. That's one account. The other is, in addition to the pushing and the moving, you need an expectation of the mind. That if you, by Pavlovian training, have come to expect things to move when you push them, and you add that to the particular case, you get causation. It gives you these two very different. One is mind dependent, the other isn't mind dependent. Anyway, if you go with the first one, the first one leads to what's called the regularity account of laws of nature. Laws of nature are nothing but patterns in what's called the Humean causation. And fundamentally there is no causation. It's a derivative notion. Now, what can we say about Hume's Humeanism? Well, Hume's Humeanism One thing is kind of crazy. Okay, nobody believes it anymore. Why? Because this whole empiricist semantic theory about where we get our ideas and our concepts and so on, it's just not true. And you can't make it work, and they could never make it work. And the logical empiricists back in the 20s tried again. The right thing to call them is not logical positivists, but logical empiricists. They were taking classic Humean empiricism and then thought, now I have first order predicate calculus. Hume didn't have that, right? What he didn't have was first order predicate calculus. I'm going to take basically Hume's idea and write it down using upside down A's and backward E's and stuff, and I'm going to get, that's going to work. Now, it didn't work. And they tried. And they tried, and it killed itself over and over again. It wasn't that it had to be killed from the outside. It killed itself from the inside.
Popper busted. Popper busted it.
Yeah, I mean, you know, and again, there was all this, I mean, everybody knows. You say, well, here's my verificationist account of meaningfulness, cognitive meaningfulness, and a sentence is cognitively meaningful if it has a truth value, if it's either true or false, right? If it's not, okay, you know, if you're interested in truth, here's my verificationist theory of cognitive meaningfulness. Somebody says, hey, that theory, is it cognitively meaningful according to itself? And they say, no. Okay, so your own theory says your own theory doesn't mean anything, or isn't true, or can't be true. Or, you know, I mean, it killed itself over and over again. And that, you know, anyway. So let's not do that. That's not a good motivation. Now, there's another kind of Humeanism that's associated with David Lewis, and that's where we get this term Humean supervenience. It really doesn't have much to do with Hume. It has to do with David Lewis. And here's the quote. Humean supervenience is named in the honor of the greater denier, and it says greater, I'm not really sure greater than who, but that's what's in the book. Denier of necessary connections, right? So the idea is there are no necessary connections in nature at a fundamental level. It's a doctrine that all there is to the world, and clearly this must be fundamentally, is a vast mosaic of local matters of particular fact, just one little thing and then another. We have geometry, a system of external relations of spatiotemporal distance between points, maybe parts of space-time itself, maybe point-sized bits of matter or ether or fields, maybe both. And at these points we have local qualities, perfectly natural intrinsic properties, which need nothing bigger than a point at which to be instantiated. For short, we have an arrangement of qualities, and that's all there is. There's no difference without a difference in arrangements of qualities. All else supervenes on that. That's Lewis's Humean supervenience. I would guess, by the way, again, to bring us back, if you're worried about the existence of deities, you're going to have a lot of trouble fitting them into this picture, right? Anyway, really nothing in common with Hume. No mention of ideas or concepts, their origin. He thinks we can think about things like point-sized, perfectly natural properties, even though we can't see them in some sense. We don't have empirical impressions of them as such. He has this concept of being perfectly natural. You can worry about that. And so laws, I mean, all these things are, all the things that Lewis makes fundamental are theoretical, what we're calling theoretical entities. They're not directly observable. That's what breaks the connection to empiricism of Hume's sort. And have the character they can't be observed at all. Now, the question is, lots of people are attracted to this. They want to be Humeans in Lewis's sense. I don't think they want to be Humeans in Hume's sense, but they like Lewis and their family. And I've always been curious about this, right? I never really quite understood the attraction of it. And I just, for the last little bit of the paper, want to talk about what I think are the subterranean psychological motivations, bring them out into the light. And again, if you think about it that way, then again, this will have ramifications also, I think, in theology and so on. What is your motivation for believing this? Maybe this is psychologically wrong, but anyway, it's what I've come up with. And I'm going to talk about two non-empiricists motivations for, and also non-Lewisian motivations for Humean supervenience. So I don't want to even get into why Lewis believes it. Why might one believe it? And let's see how they work. So, in the case of laws of nature, I have defended, as I said, I'm the theist here. I defended a primitivist view. I think there are laws of nature. I think they exist. And I think they're fundamental. I don't think they're derivative the way the Humean thinks they're derivative. They're just part of nature. Can I directly see them? No, of course I can't directly see them. Can't directly see space-time either. I can't directly see electrons either. Pretty much all the stuff I postulate in doing physics I can't directly see. I'm not worried about that. They're not local material things. Laws of nature. Sure, they're not. Okay, fine. But nonetheless, why do I believe in them? I think they're responsible for and play a role in explaining how the actual things I can observe behave. Right? How do the local things, and especially the big local things that are built out of little local things, how do they behave? That I can see. And the ultimate aim is to explain that, and I'm going to explain it in part in terms of these laws. Of course, that means our epistemic access to the laws is limited. Right? I'm not, no matter how long I spend in the lab, I will never be sure I've gotten them right. Because the best I can do is say, well, hypothetically, if these were the laws, and blah, 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 then things would behave this way that I see. That's good, you know? But maybe this whole thing is wrong, but nonetheless is giving me good predictions. We all understand that's an epistemic risk. Among these proposals, right, and again, Quine made this point, it's kind of at a technical level trivial to see. It will never be that there is a unique theory in physics which is the only one that gives rise to these empirical predictions, right? You can always monkey around and add weird things and but the weird things kind of cancel out. and so at the empirical level, but people nonetheless think, yeah, okay, fine, but these other alternatives that are parasitic are not plausible, right? I can't say I can disprove them, but I have no reason to believe them, right? You'd be crazy to believe them, even though they make the same empirical predictions. How could that be? How could you have a theory that makes all the same empirical predictions, but you'd be crazy to believe it? Simple example, maybe I've used this here before. Hypothesis. The entire universe began 2 seconds ago. I never gave the beginning of this talk. You didn't come here. All of your brains were created in this state with false memories. All of our false memories correspond to each other, so when we have conversations later, they all come here. But no, sorry, everything started, well, now it's 12 seconds ago or whatever. Okay, it's easy to see that that theory is going to make all the same predictions going forward, but it's also easy to see it's insane, right? Nobody would believe it. It fails to have a virtue that we want in our theories. It's not a straightforwardly empirical virtue. We often talk about simplicity, things like that. But you just need to think through cases like that. What's missing, clearly. So, now here are 2 objections to the primitivist view. So right now I'm in a dialogue with Barry. Barry's a Humean, I'm not. He says, oh, you believe in these primitive laws of nature. Here's one objection. As Barry, he always raises his objection. He says, I don't understand how the laws work. So I've got these laws of nature. The laws of nature, as we say, telling the particles what to do, or determining what they do, or constraining what they do, or giving probabilities for what they do. How does it do that? How does a law manage to go to an electron and say, electron, do that? What's the mechanism? How do the laws push around the particles or the fields or the quantum states or whatever? Barry says this all the time. I think this is just a mistake, okay? Why? Because obviously, and this is, if you go and review the title of this talk, which is something like where and when do, how and what end. Where do these questions of demanding further explanation end? Basically, Barry's saying, look, if you postulate laws of nature and the laws of nature are affecting the trajectories of particles, there has to be an intervening story of how this affects that. But you can see that's just logically impossible. You can't demand for every connection to then be an intervening story, because then for every part in the intervening story, there has to be an intervening story, and an intervening story is, you know, it's an infinite regress of analysis, as it were, and it's crazy. Nobody thinks that. I mean, it would be a demand nobody could ever meet. There are places where further explanation of that kind is impossible. There must be. Everybody has that. So it's not a question of rejecting that there are fundamental relations between the fundamental things. You might say, yeah, but the way they're put together in this theory is kind of ad hoc and looks crazy and so too complicated or whatever. But that there are such places, everybody has such places. And you can see that also with respect to derivative ontology. I mean, we're in the same thing with respect to derivative ontology. We start out saying some existent items are derivative, some are fundamental. It's legitimate to ask, and to point, it's obviously legitimate and to the point to ask of the derivative items how they're composed out of the fundamental ones. That's part of understanding. But clearly this has to come to an end, right? It can't be that for any fundamental item you still can ask, well, what's it made out of? I mean, at a certain point you say, this isn't, you know, this is where my spade is turned in this theory. This isn't made out of anything further. That has to happen, right? That's why I'm calling it fundamental. You say, but how can I understand it? I went through that. You understand it not by analyzing it, but by seeing how other things are analyzed in terms of it. Not, as it were, by analysis, but by synthesis. Similarly, sometimes things cause or are responsible for other things via a mechanism. You can ask how the energy produced in an engine gets transmitted to the real wheels of a car, right? That's a good question. What's the mechanism? It's the drive shaft. I see. Between the engine and the wheels, there's this other piece, the drive shaft, blah, blah, blah. But just as in the case of composition, the appeal to intervening mechanisms can't go on forever. Mechanisms require intervening elements and laws that govern them. So to ask by what mechanism do the laws determine the behavior is implicitly to ask for yet further laws and intervening structures. But that must end at the fundamental laws. They do what they do just by their nature, not by some intervening mechanism. Then logically, you're forced into this. This should not be controversial. So that's one objection I don't think works. Now there's another objection, which is quite of a different character. It's appeal to Occam's razor. And then they say, look, I, the Humean, have a certain ontology. I've got particles and fields or whatever, and they form this Humean mosaic. They're laid out in space-time in a certain way. And that's all I have. That's it. I'm done. Everything else is derivative. But you, the primitivist, you have all the stuff I had, and on top of it, you've got these laws. Right? You don't try to analyze the laws. I try to analyze. You don't try to analyze the laws. You say, yeah, guilty, guilty, guilty. That's what I'm doing. And then they say, okay, so if the laws are ontologically fundamental, then your fundamental ontology has to contain at least two sorts of things. The laws and the things the laws are about. Right? Two categorically distinct sets of items. And then they say, but what if I can get rid of one? What if I can pare down the ontology? You've got these two fundamentally different things. I don't have laws, says the Humean, in my fundamental ontology. So I'm being more parsimonious than you are, and now I appeal to Occam's razor. The razor comes in and slices out your stuff. So this is the last thing I really want to talk about, because this often comes up when people are arguing why the postulation of a fundamental item should be plausible, they'll appeal to Occam's razor. So what is the razor? All right, so at least I guess there are different statements in Latin. This is one that comes up a lot. Entia non sum multiplicanda praeter necessitate. What does that mean? What is, in particularly, what does praeter necessitate mean exactly here? What kind of necessity? If it means, here's two readings, right? If it means without good reason, That is, don't multiply necessities without good reasons. It's good advice. I really have no objection, but on the other hand, it's kind of empty, and it certainly is not particular to increasing items. You could say, if you have a good theory, don't decrease the items without necessity either, or without good reason. You should have a good reason for everything you do, right? I mean, this is rationalism. You should have a good reason for everything you do. You shouldn't subtract entities without good reason. I mean, okay, you can have no objection, but it's kind of it's a pretty empty thing. On the other hand, you might say, no, I mean by necessity, logical necessity, right? Only accept items that logic forces on you. But then, it's a really bad. It's a very strong, it's not weak, it's strong, but it's also crazy. It's more or less insane. For example, this is an example from physics. Maxwellian electrodynamics has two fundamentally different ontological basic postulates: charged matter and electromagnetic fields. Two very different things, right? The matter is not made of fields, and the fields isn't made of matter, but they both go into the equations and they interact in certain ways. Now, there were a bunch of physicists who didn't like that, and they tried to get rid of one or the other of those. They did it both ways, right? So some people said, well, maybe I can understand the charged matter as vortices in the fields. And then there were other people, famously Feynman and Wheeler, who said, we're going to get rid of the fields. We're going to give you a theory just in terms of the matter. We're going to eliminate the fields. But one thing we know is that nobody thought those theories have ever thought those theories were more plausible than Maxwellian electrodynamics. Even if you can do it, they tend to be complicated, weird equations, hard to solve. All kinds of problems come up. So that reading of the razor, the strong one, only accept an item if it's logically forced on you. That's way too strong. Don't use that. Now, I want to end with another reading, yet another reading, an even stronger reading. Because multiplicanda suggests you've got a theory with a bunch of items, and now you're adding to them, or subtracting from them, right? So you're comparing two versions that have at least some of the ontology in common. But then some people say, no, it's even stronger than that. Just take any two theories and count. How many fundamental types of things are there according to this theory? How many fundamental things are there according to that? Maybe they're completely different from each other, but just count. And the one that has fewer wins. Okay? And physicists use it. I mean, they really, Sean Carroll will go out and say, why do you believe in the many worlds theory of quantum mechanics? Because it only has one thing, a universal wave function evolving by Schrodinger's equation. It only has one thing. All these other theories have more than one thing. I win, one thing. Right? Monism. And so, again, the strong version of the razor says if you've got two ontologies, one with fewer postulated items or fewer postulated kinds of items, ipso facto it's better and more plausible. Now, this is such a strong reading that I wanted to give it a new name, which I did. Let's call it Occam's chainsaw. Right? I mean, that thing is going to go and just rip stuff out pretty much indiscriminately from any theory of the world. And here are some other ways of, if you wanted to reduce it, less is more. Or, I'm a lover of desert landscapes. You can imagine a guy with a chainsaw in the middle of the Amazon jungle saying, I'm a lover of desert landscapes, and just chopping everything up, right? I want less. But, whatever little words you use to dress it up, right? The chainsaw is basically insane. This is not good advice. It is unjustifiable. It's a destructive precept. Why? What are its consequences? Suppose that you have two proposed fundamental ontologies, the one with fewer fundamental items or fewer kinds of fundamental items would ipso facto, at least to some extent, be preferable. Follows, what's the best? A theory with zero fundamental things, right? Let's go all the way down. That's the best theory. Nothing exists. Well, that theory isn't really very plausible. Or maybe nothing fundamental exists. Now, people have played with this idea that there are things that exist, but nothing is fundamental. Everything is derivative from something further down, and it's elephants, an infinite chain of elephants all the way down, and there's no bottom. That's logically possible. I think there's no reason to believe anything maybe like that. If you had some precept that says, oh, I'll prefer a theory like that, oh, come on. You're not being serious. And here's some, 0 is the extreme case, right? If we go back to Maxwellian electrodynamics, again, now I'm just saying what I said, it postulates two sorts of fundamental things, charged particles and fields. Wheeler and Feynman tried to eliminate the fields and ended up with an intractable non-Markovian theory. This is a little technical, but the point is no physicist thought it was a good theory. Nobody's working on it. Right? They could do it and it had literally less stuff in it, but the cost for that was so high, nobody's pursuing it. Some tried to get rid of the particles in favor of vortices in the fields. Okay, sort of see the idea, but it never worked and people aren't working on it. Nobody thinks they are. Here's another way to water down the principle, which now becomes plausible, but again, now becomes kind of empty. Of two proposals for a fundamental ontology, the one with fewer fundamental entities or fewer kinds of fundamentalities is preferable ceteris paribus, right? Then you say, well, ceteris paribus, that's why they didn't like Wheeler-Feynman. The cetera were not parian, right? Because the Maxwellian theory was simple and this theory is very complicated. The problem is, of course, the cetera are never parian for two really different approaches, right? It's never that they're exactly the same except for one little gadget. If they are, then okay, get rid of the gadget if it's not doing anything, right? It may be a reasonable principle. If two theories are exactly the same on all counts, except one has a little bit more stuff, and that stuff obviously isn't doing something to produce new predictions, or they wouldn't otherwise be paria, get rid of that extra little gadget. Okay, but that never happens. So now, summing up at the end, I'm sorry I went a little late. So any theory must postulate some ontology, and that ontology can be further distinguished into fundamental items, which are not constructed from other things, and derivative ones that are. Ontologically, I would say it's the menu of fundamental items and the laws that govern them that count. If I want to evaluate a physical theory, I want you to answer me these questions. What are you postulating fundamentally, and how does it behave? And the how does it behave part is giving me the laws. And it's in terms of those that you make a judgment about whether the theory is simple or natural or harmonious or whatever. It's at that level. Confirmation theoretically, if you're not, these judgments of simplicity, naturalness, and harmony, these are as it were a priori. Right? I can make that judgment if you just write down the laws. I can kind of look at them, eyeball them often and say, yeah, that's the laws. But of course, that doesn't give me any empirical, that by itself is not empirical. Then confirmation theoretically, if I'm worried about empirical evidence, what really matters is the behavior, according to this theory, of some class of derivative entities that are the ones we count as directly observable. Needles, how they move, tracks in chambers. These are the kinds of things I can get empirical access to, and I can appeal to that as evidence for or against the theory. Since the derivative items are composed from the fundamental ones, the dynamics of the fundamental ones determine the dynamics of the derivative ones. And I think the number and types of fundamental items in a plausible theory cannot be determined a priori. Right? There's no way we can just think about it and say, oh, there must be only 1 or 2 or 10 or 5 fundamental sorts of things in the best theory. Each proposed menu of fundamental items and the way they interact with each other must be evaluated holistically as a complete architecture. It must be evaluated in terms of how well the whole hangs together and how smoothly it accomplishes for the wide variety of explanatory, semantic, and analytic tasks we ask of it. And most importantly, there's at best limited scope for a priori simplistic normative principles. One of the most suspect principles have been widely used to motivate ontological systems is Humeanism or Humean supervenience. right? So philosophers often say, I just want a Humean theory. I'm just looking for a Humean theory. That's my motivation. There's no obvious justification for the desire to impose that particular ontological straitjacket. And while there's some scope for a reasonable version of Occam's razor, there's none at all for Occam's chainsaw. Less is not always more, or more plausible. Thinking that it has led to unnatural, implausible, and tortured proposed ontologies in philosophy and physics, and I guess in theology. As in politics and government, a blind desire to cut leads to catastrophe. And that's the end.